Hi, Mike DiPaolo.
Hello, Jason. How you doing?
Good. Thank you for taking some time out of your evening to chat with me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for asking.
Where are you seated right now?
I am joining you right now from my home in lovely Lewes, Delaware, the first town in the first state. And for those of you who may out there who may not know where it is, we are right where the Delaware Bay meets the Atlantic Ocean. So
And
you
you
can see
said
that on a map.
Lewis.
It is Lewes. It's not Lewes. It
And
is
there
Lewes.
and there's you in your research you were able to confirm that pronunciation, correct?
Yes, yes. Over the years, both from what we could gather from primary sources, historical primary sources, all the way to folks who live in the community's namesake town over in Lewes, England, who would come over to visit. And actually, I was scrolling through my Facebook memories a couple days ago, a couple weeks ago, and I found a little clip that I recorded from a visitor from England, and he just happened to identify himself as being from Lewis. So I actually had him say, I asked him, could you please tell everybody how to pronounce the name of this town? And so he said, I am here to tell you that the name is Lewis. And so we were like, there you have it. It is Lewis, without a doubt.
And you were involved for many years. Well, tell us where you are now.
Well, right now I'm the vice president for Southern Delaware at the Delaware Community Foundation. And we have an office in Georgetown. My office is a satellite office of the main uh, community foundation, which is headquartered in Wilmington. And I work with a great coworker, Kelly, who manages the DCF scholarship program. But we're down here in Georgetown, and I'm on what we call the philanthropic services team. So I work with our donors and professional advisors and people who are interested in opening up a fund at the DCF.
Yeah. And before that, you were with the Lewes Historical Society, correct?
I was the executive director of the Historical Society from 2001 till 2019.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
lengthy tenure, but I'm not actually originally from here. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio. So made the
Yeah.
journey east.
Well, what I'm excited about is that you can offer listeners, especially people getting into the museum field, the perspective of not only working in the museum side of things, but also working um, on the philanthropic side as in a foundation, often working with arts and culture, I imagine.
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, and you're absolutely right about going from, not necessarily just a museum or a historic or an arts organization, but from a grant-seeking nonprofit to the foundation world is definitely different. And you might have gathered by my title and my description of what I do is that I'm not exactly, one of the folks at the foundation who decides where a grant goes, or how a competitive grant program is structured. But I work with our fund holders and I work with people who want to establish funds. So in some ways it is fundraising. In other ways, it's very different from the fundraising that a lot of people do and that I did at the Historical Society. But the a neat thing is you get to know the fund holders, the people who have donor advised funds, and we can talk about that a little bit too later.
Yeah.
I think that's an area where museums and especially smaller museums and historical societies forget about when they're fundraising.
Yeah.
Um, but I have a chance to talk to fund holders, and they have a lot of questions. They want to know what's going on, and you're able to direct them. And the biggest thing is just knowing what's going on. So, but I remember it was one of my first. Let's see, it was probably about 2 or 3 weeks after I started, and I went to a meeting of AFP, which is the Association of Fundraising Professionals, and there is a chapter in Southern Delaware down here. Um, and I introduced myself. I remember it was pouring rain, absolutely pouring rain that night, and I had to leave early to go to hand out scholarship checks, which is a really fun part of my job to kids at Cape Henlopen High School. But I introduced myself, and we were sitting there for a little while, and I suddenly realized everybody was like looking at me and they're like, oh, let's talk about the DCF grant process. And I was like, I can't answer those questions. And it was like, I was just there for like 2 or 3 weeks already. And I was like, I can't answer that. I'm not. And then you kind of really quickly realize you're on the other side of the table.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's fun and it's engaging, but you realize that the dynamic has shifted a little bit.
Yeah,
So,
definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. So did you get into, well, I mean, did you want to get into museums in college, or, what was your background there?
Honestly, I'm just probably like you and like a lot of people out there. I've loved museums since I was young. Um, I remember my mom signed me up for art classes at the Cleveland Museum of Art when
Huh.
I was really young, and I remember going there, and I remember um, I always remember just she still has one of the pieces I made out in their condo in Arizona. It's a little ceramic piece, and it's awful. It's a little cactus and a little bull skull I tried to make, and but just wandering around the museum, appreciating. My mom was also a history teacher,
Oh,
so she had a background in history. She got her master's in history too, and just having a little bit of that appreciation, for the past. I grew up with my grandparents at my grandparents' house, so um, I was with older people most of the time and listening to stories, and just always enjoyed that. And when I got to college, I didn't really know what I wanted to major in beforehand, but I remember when I got to the first year orientation and we were talking about you could visit all the departments at open houses during that orientation period before freshman year, and I saw archaeology. I was like, archaeology, that's awesome, I would love to study that. So I went to the archaeology open house and said, that's what I'm doing.
hmm.
And so I ended up majoring in archaeology, but and everybody had to do a thesis. And I did actually mine on archaeological museum collections. And the college that I went to, the College of Worcester in Ohio, had an archaeological collection from a site actually in Jordan. It's called Pella, and
Oh,
it's
sure.
part of the
Okay.
Decapolis. And I wrote my thesis on that. And I actually, as part of my independent study, I actually did a museum. I put together an exhibit with ancient Roman mosaics and glass, and how many undergraduates are able to do that as part of their senior project. So that was
Right.
just cool.
Yeah.
But really, I think aside from that, one thing in college that really led me down the museum pike, and it was the library. I worked at the special collections department at the library, and got to work with the college's archival collection. I worked with the college's Pella collection. And actually, after I graduated, this was one of the coolest things, that I got a note from my advisor, probably about 2 or 3 years after I graduated. And she said, Mike, your IS is finally complete because all the Pella archival material scattered around campus has finally been gathered together at special collections.
Hmm.
So she said, you actually made a difference in the life of the college, and we're able to bring all these things together from the president's office and from library, from the archaeology department. Even the facilities department had records from the Pella excavation. So
Huh.
she said, you can rest well now knowing that you made a little bit of an impact. So
Did they have a professor that was there at one time that collected this stuff or researched it or something?
yes, his name was Robert Smith, and this was back in the 60s. The college had a very young archaeology program, and they wanted to make a splash. And Robert Smith was pretty aggressive, and he uh, was able to secure the rights to excavate at Pella in Jordan.
Hmm.
And there was quite a blowback. The College of Worcester is a small liberal arts school in Ohio, and at the time, major universities, right, Harvard, University of Chicago, UCLA, those kind of places, they were the ones excavating the prime sites. And but Worcester excavated in Jordan, and then eventually, actually, Worcester partnered with the University of Sydney in Australia, and it was actually an international collaboration. But uh, the the materials from the first, I think, 3 or 4 field seasons ended up at Worcester, and then the University of Sydney only recently closed excavations in Jordan. And obviously, a lot of the conflict in the Middle East, put some of the excavations on hold and interrupted the seasons, and so that sort of put a damper on Worcester's involvement. But it's
Hmm.
still there, and it's a great collection of, especially Roman glass and mosaics. It's a really strong collection.
Hmm. Then, so how did you make your way to Delaware?
Well, I always want, growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, we don't have an ocean, we don't have beaches. There's Lake Erie, but back in the '80s, you didn't necessarily want to go swimming in Lake Erie too much. So my father had passed away, and my mom wanted to have a, kind of a family vacation. So she took me down to, we went to Rehoboth Beach, right, for the summer, and eventually we made our way up to Lewes. And so I was familiar with Lewes, and I knew it was a small historic town, and it was at the beach. That doesn't hurt, right? It's kind of fun. And so after college, I went to the University of Pittsburgh, and I got a master's in library science from the Master's in Library and Information Science from Pitt. And I saw that the Historical Society was looking for an executive director. And I said, oh, look, that's kind of cool. It's a small town. I know it. It's on the beach. It'd be fun to be there for a couple of years, move on to something else. And so I applied, and I was fortunate enough to actually become their first executive director back in September of 2001.
Wow.
So that's how I got here. So, growing up, coming to the beaches here, and what was the inspiration for that, Jason, is a book that I'm sure you're familiar with, Noel Hume, called Historical Archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember reading that in college, and one of the footnotes in the back said, are you interested in local historical archaeology? Contact your local historical society. And I always kept that in the back of my mind. And I said, you know what? I love Cleveland. It's a great town. It's a great city. It has a lot of wonderful things. I'm still a big Browns fan. But I didn't want to go back to Cleveland. And I said, you know what? Lewes could be a fun place to start out. And it's just been a tremendous place for me and my family and my wife, and to have a career. I've gotten a chance to do a lot of cool things here too.
So when you started at the Historical Society, tell me the budget and staff size from your first year, and then when you moved on.
So I started, my first day of work was September 10th, 2001. Okay. And I was the first full-time staff person I ever hired. Right. There was a part-time maintenance guy, Fred Hudson, who was a wonderful, salt of the earth guy, but he was very part-time and just focused on maintenance. And he was a contract employee too. He came and he had taken care of the building since 1963. Right. So he was there from the very beginning, and he just, but a wonderful guy. So it was me and a part-time maintenance guy, and the budget was right just a little south of $70,000. I think it was about $68,000. And that included me. That included my salary. That included Fred. That included taking care of, at the time, 12 historic buildings, and, who knows how many objects and photographs and papers and things that were there. So, and then when I left in March of 2019, I was the director of an organization that had 15 employees, including myself, and a budget of just about $1 million, and give or take. And yeah, all in the same town. The area around us grew, but it was really cool to do that and to be able to see the growth. And I certainly had a lot of people who, over the years, would be interns or volunteers, and they were people looking to go to grad school, people in college, people who had just graduated from college. And I told them, there's some cachet certainly being at a larger institution, but you get to see all the fruits of your work at a smaller place or a mid-sized place.
Yeah.
Where you can actually make that difference, and people get to trust you too. You're at a smaller place and you're representing their history. That's the one thing I remember telling people a lot, that you're not from here. I'm not from Lewes, but I appreciated the history, and people saw that, and that made a difference to them. So to the folks who live here, and the people who might be a donor or a supporter of the program, or just a volunteer even.
Yeah. The late Jim Vaughn used to say he felt like a conductor, and that there are all these beautiful instruments, and that really the conductor isn't playing any of the instruments, but without the conductor. So you were building this place up. A lot of instruments had to play together and the stars align. What were some of the highlight things that happened over the years that you think helped propel the Historical Society forward?
Well, I think some of the stars that aligned in such a in a tragic way. It was September 11th.
Hmm.
That was, kind of like now, the environment that we're in now with COVID. Um, People stayed closer to home. They were looking for things to do, and Lewis is just 2.5 hours from Philadelphia, 2.5 hours from DC, and people began to. Lewis had always been discovered, but people had really discovered Lewis then, right? And
Hmm.
that's when a lot of folks came. And Jim, I knew Jim from my involvement at the trust, and that's a perfect. Hold on one second. Sorry, my daughter. We all have our Zoom interruptions, right?
I've got a son
During
who's
these
about to
times.
barge in here.
Yes, Amelia wanted to make sure she could be done with her reading, so I was doing my best, but then she would not stop. Um, but the people coming over, I mean, that was a really defining moment. Is that everybody had to, you know, Lewis just the floodgates opened, and the historical society was still sort of, I don't know if I wouldn't certainly call it sleep. It was sleepy, but it wasn't sleepy in a malnourished or a
Hmm.
kind of harmful way to itself. It was just, a lot of the same volunteers from the 60s when it was founded were still involved. So, getting them, just showing them, taking them places, literally taking them to a different museum and saying, look, this is what we could do here. What do you guys think about that? What do you like? What have been your dreams and aspirations from the place? And just, showing them what other folks are doing, taking them to conferences, encouraging them to attend conferences, um, certainly was a highlight. And seeing a lot of seeing the light bulbs go off that, that, wow, this really can happen here.
Yeah.
We can attract events. We can have great exhibits. We could have a dynamic membership program. We could have more volunteer opportunities than just docents.
Hmm.
So we started to begin to expand our offerings too. I think one thing that was very conscious. I went to I wouldn't call it a conference. It was more of a workshop, um, and there was a gentleman there, Paul Reber, who was the executive director of Stratford Hall.
Yeah. Passed
And I
away a number of years ago. Yeah.
and he and I struck up a friendship, and we would see each other at this gathering every year, every other year. And I remember he told me one time, he goes, listen, he goes, unless you're Monticello or unless you're Mount Vernon and you've got a rock star, telling the story of a historic house, and he had the Lees, right? I mean, at Stratford Hall. And he's saying this, that you've got to find your rock star. And I kind of took that to heart, and I realized that for our place, for Lewis, the rock star was the town. People loved the town. They would
Mm.
walk around the town, press across the country, cool small town, quaint small town, great little economy, it's on the beach, all this stuff, historic Dutch whaling ships and all that kind of good stuff. And so I said, you know what, let's embrace the town. So we went full bore into that, and we took on, cemetery tours, walking tours, trolley tours, kayak tours. And it became, there was still a focus on some of the buildings as museums, some of the properties as museums, especially like the Cannonball House, which is the Maritime Museum, for instance. But I think being willing to embrace that and realize, I used to say something too that, I was gonna say, realize that we're more than just these 12 buildings. But one of my sayings was, we're not the 12 Buildings Historical Society, we're the Lewes Historical Society. And to really embrace that, to
Yeah.
delve into the community, be really a part of that. And that led to things, it led to being asked to be on, different councils and committees for the town, and, tourism initiatives across the state, and different things. And it's sort of, it gave the Historical Society a seat at these places where decisions were being made. And where some of the decision makers sat too. And so they got to know me, I got to know them. They would come to Lewis, and stop by and check in and say hello. So it was a great relationship. We were promoting the town, and we were getting noticed for that too. So
Yeah.
And at the same time, it built up, our revenue because the tours commanded money. And so, it was really just a great dynamic we had going.
Well, you said the idea. I mean, passing this on from Reber about embracing your rock star. Um, that's a really scary thing to do, especially for smaller institutions, historical societies, who deep down, um, a lot of folks just want to cling to the idea that their story at whatever historical society, that's the rock star. And sometimes it really isn't.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's You're absolutely right. And I think there's so much inertia. I mean, with life in general, but certainly almost by definition at local history museums, um, where change can be scary. And, for almost 40 years before I started, there was a focus on the properties. And there still was a focus on the properties. I mean, we invested a lot of money, we raised a lot of money to make sure that they were well taken care of. But so many history organizations were started in the 60s, right? In anticipation, late 50s, early 60s, in anticipation of the bicentennial. And those days were gone, but a lot of the same volunteers were still there. They were still expecting people to want to come in and look at cool, early American antiques and just sort of a different way of doing things. And I think we all know, that we've all had these discussions, velvet rope tours and things and all
Mm-hmm.
that kind of stuff. And, it was just so clear that, where there could be a lot of success and where we could take advantage of it, both from a history and awareness perspective, but also from a business perspective, was doing more with the town, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the things I'm most proud of is a cemetery database that we developed. And we did that not just to, hey, look, we can look up great Aunt Martha and see where she's buried, but it had a preservation component, because a lot of the stones are degrading over time, obviously. It had another preservation component in that now all the developers and community owners know where the cemeteries are, because there's a lot of small cemeteries around here. There's a lot of small family cemeteries. We
Mm-hmm.
don't have a big, massive public cemetery in Lewes or in southern Delaware. They're either church cemeteries or family cemeteries out in the cornfields and woods. And I'm not belittling them by saying that. That's just literally how they are.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, just what's today? Tuesday, when we're doing this, I have a call on Thursday coming up with a local magazine about the cemetery project, because it's still relevant, because people want to make sure that everybody knows where these cemeteries are, because it'd be very easy for an unscrupulous developer just to bulldoze them. But we use this to inform our cemetery tours, to do school programs, to do adult programs. It had a lot of different aspects other than just the purely historical research ones that you probably would think of first.
How did your board evolve over those years? How did it mature?
Well, I think certainly, like I mentioned before, it was primarily it was primarily made up of volunteers who had been there from the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Actually, when I started, the founder's son-in-law was the president, was the board chair.
Wow.
And he was a wonderful guy. George Elliott was his name, who was the chair. He was a great guy, a lot of respect for him. He died about maybe 6 or 7 years ago now. But the board was a somewhat of a working board. I mean, it was the woman who was in charge of the grounds, and she literally would come in and weed, right? And then it was the other guy who was in charge of the antique show, and he would literally come in the night before and put up all the little stakes around the ground where all the vendors were. And then it was, the finance guy who would come in and literally write the checks, and the secretary who would literally come in and check the voicemail.
Mm-hmm.
And then it evolved, and gradually those sort of things were taken over by staff, the real functional aspects of running a place.
Mm-hmm.
And our board evolved too. And like I said at the very beginning, I mean, Lewes, after September 11th especially, began to attract in greater numbers really professional folks from, the Washington area, Philadelphia, Wilmington, who really brought a lot of great connections. I mean, so there were people who retired to Lewes who formerly were, the curator of the National Portrait Gallery, the chief of staff of the National Archives, the director of the Presidential Library System at the National Archives, and the curator of music at the Library of Congress. I mean, it was those are the kind of people who were populating our boards and our committees. So it really brought a really high level of sophistication and connections. So it went from a board that evolved from the people literally doing the work, to ones who really cared about the organization, to ones who really cared about the organizations, but also, could bring in some really significant professional assets to bear. So it was, the appropriate evolution for a board, right? That brings challenges too. These, people are, they're from larger organizations. Sometimes there's not it's hard to scale down expectations, and it's hard to, when you have at the National Archives, and you have like a 13,000 person bureaucracy, it's hard to scale it down to one that has 10 or 13 people doing things. But at the same time, I think they really gained an appreciation for what we were doing, and realized that we had the ability to be flexible, and we had the ability to pivot. We had the ability to really connect with the community in a way that they couldn't before, because they were just at such a large organization. Actually, one of those guys, the former curator of the Portrait Gallery, he was from Lewes. His family had been in Lewes for centuries, and he was the last of a line. And he was he turned out to be a great friend. He died, God, now about almost 15 years ago. Well, 16 years ago now. But he, the connections he had, the collections he had, the knowledge he had that he was willing to share, and the professional expertise, right, that we still drew on after his death. One of my favorite stories was a guy who had a little ramshackle cottage down on the beach, called me up. It was in August, and he said, my parents had this house on the beach, and there were these 2 old paintings. Can I bring them to you to look at? And if you want them, you can have them. Very typical story. And I wasn't expecting much, and he brought them up, and one of them was absolutely, they were a pair. It was a mother and a son, and the portrait of the mother, her name was Susan Moore, and it was exquisite. It was just an exquisite pastel portrait, and on the back it had her information, her age at the time that she sat for the portrait, and it was attributed to a Mr. Town, and we had no idea who Mr. Town was, and we couldn't find him listed in any registers or anything. And I just got on the email and said, I contacted the Portrait Gallery, and I said, I'm Mike DiPaolo from Lewes, and Robert Stewart gave me your name and said I could contact you if we ever need anything. And we were invited. We brought the painting over to DC and had it evaluated, and it was pretty cool to take it back into the conservation area and have them look at it. And
Neat.
It was pretty cool to be able to leverage those kind of connections. So
yeah, and you were able to with all of that, those connections, before you left, you were able to open a pretty big project, correct?
Yeah, that's right. We opened a museum. Of course, we had historic properties, and we had other small exhibit spaces, but our collections were just taking over the building, and they weren't, it wasn't a matter of things that had no relevance or duplicates, triplicates. It really wasn't museum collections per se. It was archives. And we were able to work with the city of Lewes to take over the old library building. And the Lewes Public Library they built themselves a new building next door. And it made sense to create what we were calling a cultural campus, right? With the library, with the Historical Society. It's in a park called Stango Park that hosts concerts and other things like that. So, and there was a bike trail goes through it and everything. So it's a great spot for the community. But, over the time, I mentioned, I think a little earlier about, gaining people's trust, being there for so long, right? 2001 to 2019, people get to know you, and they see that you're committed. And I got to know a few key folks who, were able to be willing to donate some significant financial resources to the project, to the program. And we actually had a mandate from the city that they didn't want the building to sit empty. They wanted it to be used. And we were given pretty much about a year to make that happen. And so we actually fundraised, developed an exhibit program, built the exhibits, and opened up on, I think it was July 7th,
Wow.
2017. And it was a massive undertaking. I was exhausted at the end of it.
Yeah.
But it's a first class spot. I mean, the exhibits are, if I do say so myself, are fantastic. The staff was involved, the community was involved. We did some things that were fun. We actually opened up a children's museum in one of the wings, and the old children's wing of the museum is now the Children's Museum. And there's lots of great interactives. And that's a unique asset for not just Lewes, but for Southern Delaware and the Delmarva Peninsula. There's not too many interactive spots like that around. So it's a great resource for the community. And I still have a sense of pride every time I drive by the building.
Yeah. Did you, in the years leading up to that, did you and the organization wrestle with the tug of war of building a new building and doing a big capital campaign on a just a clean slate site versus acquiring a building? Did you go through those, or did you kind of know what you wanted from the beginning?
No, we definitely talked about that, and we had a lot of really good conversations. One of the things that was really in the favor of using an existing site was quite honestly and very practically the cost of real estate in Lewes. And for a small town in Southern Delaware, real estate is pretty expensive, and it's even more expensive now than it was even 3 or 4 years ago. So we knew that our best bet was probably to be able to utilize an existing building, probably a public building. The library was an obvious example. There were other ones at the time too. The Board of Public Works, which is our public utility in town, had a space that they were thinking about abandoning that could have been appropriate for this. There was talk at one point in time about the post office potentially leaving Lewes, and that was another possibility. But really it came down to the fact that the Historical Society was landlocked. There was no growth organically off the existing campus, the main campus. And there were really no logical spots in town, empty lots to build on. So it really came down to either using the library or probably waiting another 50 years before something else really became available.
Wow. So fast forward, you're in your new role, and I know you wanted to talk a little bit about donor advised funds. I know that's it's a big deal in museums, and it can those funds for the most part are very beneficial for a museum, but they're also something you have to manage and keep track of, and manage also donor expectations, that sort of thing. So again, just specifically, what's your involvement with the foundation, with those funds and cultivating them? And
Sure. Well, first, just to give a really brief overview of what a donor advised fund and sort of what it isn't. So a donor advised fund is when somebody has a relatively significant amount of money that they want to be charitable, they have charitable intentions with. They may have a tax situation that they want to alleviate by making a donation, but let's say they don't want to give that much money to any nonprofit, a small nonprofit or a large nonprofit at one time. Like for instance, at the Delaware Community Foundation, our minimum for a donor advised fund is $15,000. And so what would happen is, let's say, Jason Alari establishes the Alari Family Fund, and it's $25,000 at the Community Foundation. Then there's two kinds of funds. You can either be endowed or non-endowed. And an endowed fund permits you to only use 5% a year. So 5% of $25,000 would be, about $1,250 a year, right? So you'd have $1,250 a year that you could grant out. If you had a non-endowed fund, the entire amount would be available. One reason people like to do donor advised funds is because it offers a little bit of privacy. So instead of calling it the Alari Family Fund, maybe Jason wants to call it the Cedar Tree Fund. I don't know.
Okay.
You can name it whatever you want to name it within reason. So, maybe Jason doesn't want people to know that he can do that, or he doesn't want people knocking at his door all the time for funds. Like we know everybody goes in and takes a picture of the donor wall at the local museum or the library after a capital campaign. I've
Right.
done that. Everybody's done that.
Yeah.
So it can offer a little layer of privacy. But the donor advised funds, they're not necessarily obligated to give money out, and they can be their own kind of grants committee if they want. It could be me and my wife. We could involve our children when they get older in making grant decisions or even recommendations. Some donor advised funds will even allow solicitation of proposals from nonprofits.
Okay.
Almost like a little mini grant cycle. But the most important thing that I think museums, especially small museums, can do is A, seek out your community foundation, make sure you're aware of their grant programs. But when it comes, because they'll have competitive grant programs just like any foundation, but they also have DAFs or donor advised funds, and you can't necessarily get in front of those. But what you can do is get in front of people who work at the community foundation and let them know, hey, this is what we have going on. This is our program. Put them on your email list, put them on your mailing list. And just keep them up to date. I can't stress that enough. There was an opportunity that arose shortly after I started at the foundation when a local food pantry contacted me and said, we would just love to show you what we do. We'd love to show you our facility. We'd like to have you come and see the time when we would hand out food. It's a Monday morning. So I said, sure, that's great. I'll come by and love to see the operation, have a chance to meet you.
Mm-hmm.
And later that afternoon, literally later that afternoon, somebody walked into my office and said, I'd like to support a local food organization. I don't want to support a big one because I feel like they probably have enough resources. I want to support one on the ground that's doing work with real people. Do you have any recommendations? And I was able to say, well, guess what? I just happened to see this local that's doing amazing work. It's all volunteers. Did you know they've served over 114,000 meals since they were founded? I had all the information at my fingertips. And, that generally doesn't happen. Somebody walks in the same day. But I can tell you, after, there's another person who I work with who is very interested in history, who's very interested in the environment. And organizations who put their information in front of us, I can get it to them.
Yeah.
And I can say, I know you care about history, and I know that, the Lewes Historical Society is doing X, Y, and Z. And I can't necessarily ask them to fund it, but I can just say, look, I know you care about this, and I thought you would be interested in knowing about this.
Right.
And it's pretty powerful. So just normal communication, just put and not just community foundation staff, but all foundation staff, find the one who's your liaison and for your area, for arts and history or culture or whatever you may fall under, and put them on your mailing list, put them on your email list, stop in once a year and just have a chat. We love it. It's great. I used to do it. I used to go over to the Delaware Community Foundation, to my very office, and sit down with my predecessors and just explain what we were doing that year.
Yeah. I used to have coffee with the executive director of a family foundation, and he used to say to me, it's amazing, Jason, how many folks just, we might give them some funds one year, but then like I never hear from them. I don't know how they're doing, or prior to funding that I don't know anything about. And then I'll get a sort of a cold call. And I think there's a little bit of that intimidation factor that I think, smaller institutions maybe have to work toward getting over, is that these folks, for the most part, are pretty genuine. They care about their communities, and they don't mind if you reach out to them and talk to them about your project. And this guy over coffee, he just said to me, I'll tell you no when I can't give you any money. I'll just say no,
Exactly.
but please reach out to me and have coffee with me. And a lot of times I'll say yes.
You just don't know till you ask, right? I mean, you got to, and the best fundraising situations, right, are the ones that you don't even have to make the ask.
Right.
The ones where people know what you're doing, they trust you, you've built an authentic relationship with someone. I think about that with the museum at the Historical Society. We had there was a family I was introduced to many years ago, and she had moved out of town, but they maintained a home in town, and I would just send her a note once or twice a year. I'd send her our little historical journal that we put out with a little note, and I'd send her a note at the end of the year and just let her know what was going on. And probably for about a decade, I didn't hear anything from her, not a word. And I was literally getting ready to go home for the day. It was about a little after 5 o'clock, and the phone rang, and I said, do I get it, or I just let it go to voicemail and return the call tomorrow? And I said, I should just
Get it.
I should just answer it. So I picked up the phone. Hello. Now, Michael, this is so-and-so. And I just want to let you know, I've heard all about the museum project. I've been following along. I want to let you know, I want to make a $500,000 gift to help get you started. And it was literally I don't want to say it was that simple, but it requires a little bit of patience too, right? And it requires not always asking for something, just being a person, sometimes, I mean, when I say I didn't hear anything, it's not like it was radio silence. Every now and then, I'm trying to find out more information about my great grandmother's house. Can you help me there? Just little things like that.
Right.
But suddenly, out of the blue, just this phone call that changed everything. And then later on, another gift on top of that. So it was just just for being, just sort of for doing your job, right? But that long-term cultivation of relationships is just critical.
Yeah. I think one of the most powerful things that you can say to a funder or a foundation is, if I do come and I ask for something, it's going to be because we really need it, and because it's an authentic, genuine ask that, and otherwise I'm not going to make up a project just so that I can ask you for funds. And funders, they've been around the block. They know, they can sniff out all of those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And you know what? It's funny. We were talking a little bit before we hit record on this, that, just the kind of projects that you want, it is about an authentic relationship and being on the other side of the funding table, in a lot of ways. Part of my job, and a lot of community foundation staff is like this. There's definitely the grant program staff whose job it is to evaluate, and it's hard. I've been involved with some of the processes, and you want to support everything, and you're human. You see the need, you see the good projects, but there's only a finite amount of money. But it's kind of fun to be in my position. I know other community foundations might not have something exactly comparable, but there are other staff out there whose job it is to find out what's going on and to sort of be the eyes and ears and inform people and be an advocate. Part of my job is to let the rest of our staff know what's happening down here in Southern Delaware, or else to make sure that the fair amount of grant money is coming back down into Southern Delaware. And I don't get to have a say necessarily in those decisions, but whenever I meet with somebody, you better believe I get on the phone or I send an email up to my colleagues and say, hey, I want to let you know I just met with the local theater group. They've got great plans, and here's who's involved, and here's what's going on. If any other questions, let me know. Or I just met with the library. They're looking at a capital campaign, and they're doing this. They have this neat idea about splitting their service or something, whatever. And sometimes it works out right away, and sometimes it might take a couple cycles. But that's part of my job, and that's it's a fun part of my job, is to get to see all that's going on and connect the dots, not just with our internal grants, but with our fund holders and even other individuals and even other foundations, to help inform what's going on.
Yeah, cool. Well, we're coming up on the 45-minute, probably past mark at this point. Time flies
when you're having fun, Jason.
Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to share or plug or anything? Or
oh man, I don't know. I mean, I guess in terms of what folks might be looking for on these podcasts is just to, just to get out there and build those relationships, be authentic about it, have fun. People can tell when you're not having fun, and people, for all the serious benefits that museums and historical societies bring to communities, to, telling undertold stories and collecting materials from underrepresented populations and helping to be economic drivers. There is something still to be said about, bringing a little levity, having some fun, making it enjoyable. And I think that's something we take for granted a little bit, but we really can bring that, whether it's a fun program for kids or something, it's okay to have a little bit of fun, especially in times like this, because I think we all need it.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's what usually people remember too.
Yeah, definitely. Were you ready for the lightning round?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Bring it, Jason.
All right. So you have to choose. You can't have both. So I've got 3 questions for you. The first one, caviar or cheese whiz and crackers?
Cheese whiz and crackers.
Oh man. Yeah, you went right to it.
I didn't have to think about that one.
Let's see. Browns or Patriots?
Browns. I grew up in Cleveland, man. The Browns all day long. Don't forget, Bill Belichick started off his head coaching career in Cleveland.
That's where he learned all his.
Where he learned all the great tricks of the trade.
Yeah. And then finally, billiards or bocce?
I go bocce. We've got the Italian in me, right, Jason? Come on, we gotta stick with bocce. And actually, there's a bocce court right around the corner from my house in a park that's here, so I could go over and play bocce whenever I want. So
nice.
Is it like this?
In the same park where the museum's located, or different park?
It's a different park.
It's
a different park. Yeah. No, the museum is not very far away, but this park is literally right around the corner. So it's a nice thing to have.
Well, Mike, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for spending the time with me and sharing your insights, and it's been a blast.
Jason, thank you for doing this. I think it's really needed. And I hope everybody out there in the small and mid-sized museum world and the museum world in general, can find this and realize that everybody has so much to offer.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I'll be in touch.
All right. Thanks, Jason. Take care.
Bye.